Alex shows how working across systems, multiple boundaries, and different players can be facilitated through embedded research and specifically through participatory action research. In this video, Alex shares his critical companionship story of working with disadvantaged young people in a marginalized rural community in Minnesota in the US. Through using approaches underpinned by critical creativity and the SYSTEMS acronym, young people, in a context of very little power or money, were helped to become highly engaged in the process, gain leadership experience, and undertake embedded research to underpin the case that they put to the City Council. This facilitation enabled these young people to change the negative view that adults within their own community held about them, to have a voice in influencing City Council policy, and in gaining funding for a new youth service that empowered them. Another key result was that the city became involved in the issues brought forward by the young citizens and changed the way it worked.
Hi there, my name is Alex Fink. I use he, him pronouns. I am an assistant professor at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is in the United States, as north as you can get before we hit Canada, and directly in the center, right by Lake Superior and that big band of the Great Lakes. My hope to share with you today is a little bit about doing systems change work in youth work settings, which is my background and expertise. I do work around systems change, embedded research, and specifically in participatory action research work with young people around the state of Minnesota and actually globally. I have done a great deal of work in many different places around the world, all of which is focused on supporting young people to explore issues that are of interest to them, and then to elevate those issues alongside of them in ways that help to create some change. So this is all premised on embedded research, where we're doing research kind of in the context that the issues are taking place, in the context of the systems challenge, and then working across multiple different boundaries with multiple different players and parties and factions to sort of negotiate how to create change over time when we're in situations where we have few resources, where we have very little power. If there's anyone who has kind of less power than nurses or social workers or youth workers, it's young people themselves. And I think that's fairly universal in many places around the world, and certainly is true here. So how do we justify and create some significant change when we have little of that resource and little of that power, but still know that something needs to happen? So this short conversation that I'm having with you today is just going to share with you a little bit about my experience doing that, and specifically a story kind of following a single thread alongside a group of young people that I worked with in order to create some fairly significant change, again, without much money to back it up. So to give you a little context for my experience around systems change work, I have been doing it for quite a bit of time, but didn't necessarily conceptualize it that way. When I met with Angie Titchen and got the chance to sort of spend a few days working with her, you can see the pictures that are some of the results of that here. One of the things that we did was to start thinking about, or really feeling our way into, the sort of the world beyond just thinking, and just this sort of cerebral academic mindset. And one of the things that I took away from that I've really appreciated has been an emphasis on bringing some critical creativity into the work that I do with young people. And so I'll share some of that with you here too, because it's become embedded in the way that I do research with young people, and then also present and utilize that research to create some change. So you can see a couple pictures from my work here with Angie, but I'd also like to show you a couple pictures from my work with young people as we work through kind of this systems change acronym. I really like the system acronym here. I think it's super relevant to doing work with young people as much as it is anyone else. So I'd like to tell you my story here within the context of this acronym, and I'll show you a couple images as we go. So the particular story that I'm telling is one that reflects a number of different experiences that I've had working in somewhat marginalized communities around the United States. This one in particular was in a rural community that, though it had some additional institutional supports that many rural areas do not. It had a couple of universities in the area and some larger manufacturing organizations. So there was more of an economy than there might have been in a much smaller rural town. But still, this town is about an hour outside of a major city. Uh, there, um, there is kind of a complex sort of socioeconomic range of experiences going on for the different folks that are involved. There's some racial kind of tensions and segregation that's a part of the community. So they're facing a number of different challenges. One of those challenges that had been persistent for a number of years prior to the pandemic was youth unemployment, and specifically businesses in the area, and there were a number of them, needed employees and really needed young people who were willing to work kind of for lower salaries at jobs at the grocery stores, gas stations, cafes, and those kinds of places where it was much more difficult to kind of fill with adults who needed to make some more income. So we had this funny mismatch that was going on where adults in the community were saying publicly that young people these days were apathetic and lazy and didn't want to work. And then when I started talking to young people about the issue and when our group was talking with them, one of the things that they realized was actually young people did really want to work, but they couldn't quite figure out how to get to work. So one of the things that this group did was they brought together a group of young people from around the local area and tried to draw kind of a diverse group of representative high school age students, and got the group together and got them sort of excited about doing a process of trying to understand this issue, to talk to each other and to others about it, and then maybe develop some solutions for it. And they had kind of a small pot of money, very little, to support this, and they had the support of a few adults in the community, but that was kind of it. And so the first thing that they did was bring together this group of young people. They probably brought about 15 young people together from a couple of the area schools and started out with some training that involved this first piece, stimulating and facilitating high engagement. And so there was some icebreakers and some kind of warm-up activities and team activities. But the real purpose of this was to get people kind of engaged enough to start doing some work to talk about the more real issues that were at play, that young people were facing in the community. And that was where the motivation really clicked in. And so the stimulating high engagement piece was both about facilitating activities that were exciting and engaging and interesting and creative, and about taking up issues that really mattered to the young people who were involved. And when we started to have those conversations, that's when young people were getting excited. And so we started to sort of peel back, like, what are some of the root causes? What's going on that this issue of youth unemployment is so apparently misunderstood in the community? And so one of the things that we did was that we started to map it. And so here you can see this was me up at the whiteboard doing some mapping of another issue. This isn't actually the one that I'm talking about right now because this one happened during the pandemic. But the one that I'm talking about now, this looked very similar, where we started mapping out some of the different issues, and young people were creating note cards or post-it notes about the various issues. We were starting to organize and sort them. And then we did things like make issue maps, where we would try to figure out what were the root causes of some of these, and power maps, where we tried to figure out who in the community had some leverage over these issues. And really, we just spent a lot of time kind of exploring and sorting through these issues. Well, we built some excitement about the various topics that were at play here. And so you can see some examples of this here, even though this isn't for the specific issue that I'm talking about. This was a real group that was working on some other related issues in the town. The yielding in practice piece was, and I think is, one of the most important here. And so one of the things that we did was we made it very clear from the outset that the adults were not governing or running this process. We were here to support. Adults were there to facilitate the logistics and make sure everybody got together and got some snacks, but they weren't there to actually run the change-making work. They were there as supporters and allies. And so one of the most important pieces was to starting to yield different pieces of this work to the folks who were involved. Who wants to make a plan for us about this project? What kinds of things need to go in the plan? Now that we have an overall kind of plan, how do we work backwards to figure out what we need to do today and next week and the week after that and the week after that to get this thing done? And who wants to take some responsibility for holding the agenda next week? And who wants to take some responsibility for bringing a fun activity for us next week? And then who wants to do it the next time and the next time and the next time? And so a big piece of this is once people were motivated and excited to do this work was handing the work over bit by bit by bit. And one of the challenges that you run into working specifically with young people is oftentimes that young people who haven't been a part of a lot of leadership opportunities before have never been given this much responsibility for running a group, and certainly not by adults kind of handing it over. So one of the important pieces here was to make those handovers as often as possible, but also invitations rather than demands. And so we would kind of say, hey, who wants to run the agenda next week? Oh, nobody's raising their hand. Does anyone want to run it with me? And then someone finally would say, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And so it took a couple of times of sort of co-facilitating before someone was willing to say, yeah, sure, I can do that now, right? And so there's kind of the slow handoff process. The yielding in practice was not immediate. It was over multiple and many meetings, and it kept happening, right? There kept being new moments where everybody defaulted to looking back toward the adult in the room. And the adult's job, the sort of coach or facilitator's job, was to keep yielding back, to keep returning that work to young people who are supposed to be the ones that were in charge of this group. So the system challenge that we were encountering was that young people were not actually apathetic. They did actually want employment. They wanted to work. But as we started to investigate this issue in more detail, and we did those power maps and those issue maps and stuff like that, what we started to find was actually that young people didn't have way to get to work. And so because this was a rural community and it's relatively spread out, and there's not very many other options for transportation, especially in a state that has very extreme weather in the winter, it meant that young people couldn't consistently get back and forth the many miles that they might need to travel from where they lived to where they would work. And so unfortunately, that meant that they couldn't apply for these jobs. And so there was this huge mismatch where employers were thinking, oh, young people don't want to work. And young people were thinking, I want to work, I just can't get there. And nobody was seeing that issue was happening in between these two different systems until we started to map it. And then when we started to map it and talk to other young people out in the community, what we started to realize was there was a small segment of young people who did have access to a car, who did have a driver's license and could get to work. However, those young people and their families were well enough off that they didn't really have to go to work. And so they weren't applying for these jobs. Many other young people who wanted to work but couldn't get there did have access to a car, but couldn't afford the costs that were associated with getting a license, namely the education process that has some fees associated with it, and then the license application and the licensing itself. And so as we started to have these conversations, one of the things that we realized was that the assumptions that all were at play here between the multiple different systems about what the actual issues were almost all misinformed. And it took really going out and doing some research that crossed all of these different systems and kind of putting the pieces together and puzzling it out to figure out what was actually going on here and to figure out that the cost of driver's education and license was the problem. The enabling step for us was really about figuring out, now that we know this information, what do we do with it? And so this small pot of money that the organization had set aside for young people to spend, what they decided to do was to create a grants program to, as a pilot sort of, to give out funds to other young people in the community who wanted to apply for a job but needed to get their driver's license, so that the scholarship would pay for their driver's education and the licensing process so that they could get a driver's license and then get a job. And so that this group of young people that had this small pot of resources and was doing the systems change work created this scholarship, advertised it, gave out their first scholarships, and modeled in this sense, right? They modeled the possibility of solving the systems challenge. And what ended up happening was that the young people who got these scholarships the first time through this pilot round did get their driver's license. So that was a huge success. And then actually got employed. And so they started addressing the systems challenge that was taking place. And one of the things that happened at the end was that this small group of dedicated youth modeled the possibility of solving this broader issue and seeing this broader issue, not just as an issue of apathetic young people or unemployment, but as a broader systems challenge to do with poverty and low incomes, to do with transportation, to do with education, and to do with city policy. And so the city council actually ended up responding after a couple of years of this pilot program and saying, you know what, we need to be part of providing this scholarship. We need to step up and fund it. And so the city itself changed how it worked and changed its policies in order to respond, which I thought was a pretty exciting response. I just wanted to show you this last slide here with my testing assumptions documentation. This is yet another group that I had worked with that I think did a wonderful job documenting in color and creativity that I mentioned before after working with Angie, some of the evaluation and research data that was coming up for them. And so now this has become a major part of my process and making this research work fun and interesting and engaging. We're researching real problems. We're doing it on the ground in the community. We're doing it in creative ways, whether it's doing interviews on the street or creating graffiti walls in high schools where we put out huge poster walls of paper and let students write responses, to creating kind of data gathering and analyzing together by drawing and painting and kind of creating mosaics of different work. So one of my favorite activities now that we use is having every young person in our group kind of do a drawing of themselves or a drawing of themselves in this group or a drawing of the issue and then putting them all together in one place and creating this big mosaic and then asking people to interpret it and asking for multiple interpretations, remixing our mosaic in a new way and then asking for more interpretations. And I think it's wonderful to kind of play around with exploring data in this way to teach us about the systems challenges that we are engaging with as we do it. So I think that's about it for me. I guess the last thing that I'll just mention is that I think that using the systems acronym and using the elements of critical creativity, we can sort of like realign collective work across multiple different systems to kind of take on the ways that sort of traditional power systems work. I think oftentimes young people, even the adults that work with young people, social workers and youth workers, I think nurses as well, right? We're kind of on the margins of power in some ways in the roles that we play. And I think that sometimes finding attunement across those multiple systems and building through this system acronym and some embedded research, this kind of like grounded story about what's going on, and then modeling these small changes can actually have some really significant impacts in the end, even if it seems like a huge uphill battle to create change. And I will say, like this story and other experiences I've had, they are uphill battles in some ways, but they're also sort of step-by-step fun and powerful and meaningful work along the way too, for me and for the others that are involved and the young people that are involved. And so part of it is like that work is really valuable. And then that systems work is really valuable. And then the end result of it is sometimes that those systems get better at talking to each other over time too. And so in this particular neighborhood and a couple of others that I've worked in, the community has started to engage with each other in different ways, and specifically to engage with young people in really different ways, as they've seen the kinds of impacts that young people can have over time and the power of those impacts. And I think that's really exciting to me as a possibility for systems change work that not only changes around a particular problem, but that changes the ways that people see each other and interact and work with each other. So in effect, changes how the system as a machine works over time too. All right, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. I hope that your own work with systems change and critical creativity is having some really powerful effects like this too.
You have just heard Alex claim that critical creativity and the systems acronym work. If you haven't heard of either before and want to follow them up, here you go. There's a link to a definitive ebook about critical creativity put together by Brendan McCormack and myself, and you'll find that in the main critical companionship references. For the systems acronym, there is a document in Domain 5 in the resources.